comments? Okay.
I just want to hear a little bit more about the role of psychiatric patients in the movement, because it seems that the perspective that was presented was of psychiatric reform as being led by experts, professionals, but in the North American context, we always talked about that movement as being led by survivors, patients, whatever you want to call. Is that the way the Brazilian sort of story is also unfolded, or?
If you look at the official history, you'll see many patients that are prominent figures of the movement. From the beginning, there is a very strong intention to put patients with an important role, and it has been done mostly in great cities like Rio, São Paulo. But as I said, this didn't imply, for example, a strong recovery movement. No. So if we are realistic about it, I think, although many people wouldn't like to hear this criticism, I think that in Brazil, their role has still yet to be empowered. They are somewhat, I wouldn't say dependent on the workers, the mental health workers' role, but they are accessory. They're not as important as they are. They don't have a very strong voice as they have in the US, for example. You can see, for example, how many books have been written by these people. I would say none, but a handful of books. Yeah, but very few. Very few people who write for themselves. If you go to a public, to a congress, for example, of the mental health movement, you will see lots of them. If this meeting was in Portuguese, perhaps there would be some of them, but not in English, because so it has been something that the movement thinks about always, but we haven't been able to put them in a strong position. But that's what I think. I have colleagues here who would disagree strongly and say that they have been a very important player in this process. They have been, but not as important as they should have been.
Would you lay any of the blame anywhere? I guess I'm curious if you think that maybe that the authority of particular disciplines somehow also plays a role. So is that something?
I'm not sure. I think that there is something that is very present in, for example, in American culture, and is not here. The presence of these advocacy groups around particular needs or interests of the civil society. This is not very strong in Brazil, as it is in the U.S. and even I believe in the U.K., for example.
I do not disagree strongly with you, but but some details. I think in 2001, the movement against asylums and the movement for the psychiatric reform split in two. And we have nowadays two movements. One is called the National Movement of Anti-Asylum Fight, and another is the Network of Anti-Asylum Fighters or something like that. And in the first one, the MENLA, the participation of patients is greater, is stronger than in the other. So they made some congress and some meetings with not a huge number, but a moderate number of patients taking part.
And having a second thought or remembering something I didn't mention, Rossano mentioned a very strong battle against this coordinator of the Ministry of Health that was presented by the last government, and we made huge meetings all around the country. People talked against it. I talked, he talked, and in all these movements, all these meetings, there were patients also talking. If you come here in February, in the carnival, you will have groups of patients with their own, what we call blocos. How would we call blocos? Samba groups that are samba groups.
Parades, carnival.
Yeah, samba parades.
Floats.
Floats.
The special sort of.
No, no floats.
Education.
No, just a bunch of people going off the street or something.
Yeah, with samba, and there are samba contests in many cities. Every group has its own samba, and the patients they build their sambas, and there are the contests which is the best samba, and this happens in here in São all over Brazil. So yeah, they're not invisible.
But isn't this still led by the mental health workers?
I wouldn't say led by them. Of course, they're important. They're important, but they try to give the principal roles for these people. There are even groups, musical groups. The Harmonia Enlouquece. It's a musical group. Yeah, theater groups with patients. In São Paulo, there is a very interesting one. Yeah, it's a bit, well, nearby, not nearby, half an hour here, from here, there is a kind of a Madness Hotel. Yeah, you can go there. It's a very interesting place where people go to stay there as if it were a budget, not a budget hotel. It's a place where you can go and stay there for days, weeks. People who come to study things. Yeah, like a hostel. Yeah. And yes, a mix of a hostel and yeah.
And the director of this place was dismissed still by the last coordinator before the Michel Temer government, and he's now in Canada. When I was last week in Montreal, and Lawrence Kilmeyer told me this guy is now here with me because he lost his job. He lost his job and is doing PhD here, and we are writing together an article on Mr. Silveira, who is this Brazilian psychiatrist and psychiatrist who created this museum of the conscious in that hospital, where many patients were doing art, and it's very famous. And there is now a movie that you can watch on this person, Mr. Silveira, who died 2 years ago, and Judy and Benilton new hair, and so that was very important here for doing so. Not psychiatric, but in our place.
Well, our group movement in Switzerland.
It was much more than that, because she came into an asylum in the 1940s where there was really heavy treatments, electroshocks, and people being treated very unhuman, and she put all those people to do art, and it set us so did a whole revolution in those patients.
She was a disciple of Carl Jung.
Yes, it was a
Pessoal, observação. É para dar a entender a eles que, por exemplo, a experiência de estar pirando, pirata, pirou, por exemplo, né? Um bloco como esse, não tem nada a ver com experiência de subcultura, um tratamento psiquiátrico voltado para a subcultura brasileira. É diferente, por exemplo, de um psiquiatra, vamos supor, o canadense, feito Kirmaia, que vai tratar os índios inuí com os elementos dele. Essa ideia de sambar, porque a gente quer sambar, não tem da parte de quem organiza, nem da parte de quem está organizado, caráter de experiência terapêutica transcultural. Isso é uma coisa muito do Brasil, para poder eles entenderem, acharem que a gente está tendo um conceito, ou experiências conceituais ou práticas que se assemelhem a essa ideia de etnicidade, raça, papapá.
Julia is saying something that's quite interesting, is that you can see in countries where the cultural, ethical issues are very important, psychiatry and the health system in general, they tend to build up on what they call cultural competence, the means of taking part of the culture that is being addressed, and with that make a bridge with their, let's say, therapeutic intentions. So you make an experiment that builds on these cultural elements, but that have a cultural, therapeutical goal. This is not what happens in these samba movements. This is not what happens. Because, perhaps because we just don't have this cultural competence idea among us. Why? Because, as I said, this would be a very interesting discussion, we don't have this identity issue very strongly nested in our day-to-day life. So when people gather to make sambas and dance and so on, it's just that. What the professionals do is help people to organize themselves, get money to build up the fantasies and so on, the costumes and stuff. But there's no therapeutical goal in that. It's just life. That's what life and citizenships. That's what it draws on that main idea that what psychiatry is about. It's about social suffering. It's about relational powers and citizenship. Basically that. Just afterwards comes mental disorders, diagnoses, and so on.
Yeah, because we don't have these political identity issues like you have in the UK, Canada, or the US. So diversity there is diversity, but diversity is less important than homogeneity as Marcelo Ribeiro said. Brazil is a nation, an ethnicity nation. So he said, okay, of course there are differences between Brazilians in North and South, but to be Brazilian, it's more important than to be North, South, black, white, etc. So that's why the issue of cultural diversity didn't get into psychiatry, because we have a psychiatry which is very political oriented, but to be political oriented in Brazil doesn't mean to do multicultural psychiatry, like Kiel, transcultural psychiatry.
So I don't understand how you talk about social suffering without locating it culturally.
No, locating it culturally, of course.
Sorry.
But we don't have, for example, transcultural psychiatry is practically non-existent in Brazil.
Okay.
Because we don't have these boundaries on which this kind of psychiatry builds upon. As we were saying in the coffee break, one of the reasons I think that psychoanalysts here are so suspicious about this dialogue with the disability rights movements is the issue of identity, because they are suspicious that when you begin to favor the autism identity issues, you are crystallizing identity. Whereas psychoanalysts will tend to make it a flow of identities rather than a strong identity for you to anchor your life in. So this is one of the reasons why the dialogue between psychoanalysts, who are very important still now in mental health, is so difficult with people from the disability right. But of course, this is also a misunderstanding of the issue of identity. And Hannah was talking about this identity issue. I think she's going to say a couple of words about it, because it's really something that we have to address with psychoanalysts and with the disability rights movement. As I was saying, when we go to disability rights movement meeting, we act like, or we talk like psychoanalysts, say something like, listen, okay, the autistic identity is very important for political reasons. But when we talk about people who live in this condition, it's rather more interesting to downplay the importance of the diagnosis or the identity label, and to talk about people, talk about experience, talk about variety of experiences. But when we talk to psychoanalysts, then we put ourselves on the other side and say, listen, okay, subjective experience, singularity, and so on, but remember that the identity issues for the disability rights movement is a matter of addressing civil rights demands. So it's very important. We can't just throw this away. So it's a...
Okay, I'm not going to say exactly this, but thinking about, because I'm a social psychologist or a sociologist, from my experiences, what I'm doing in my research, and the talks in those settings I've been seeing, it was, you're not really using the terms as an identity in a kind of more neurotypical way, but it maybe it's more in a kind of, for instance, in different kinds of struggles with, as in the parent-dominated movement, was a lot of struggles around labels, as which label are we going to use, where this label people with autism was used by the parents, and the self-advocates were saying, no, we are Asperger's. So in that specific context, it was very important to label yourself as an Asperger, not a person with autism. But in another context, like in this group I've been researching, it was not really important to talk about yourself as a specific kind of identity label. It was more about talking about other different practices and experiences, and oh, you experienced that too. There are a lot of talks about the bubble, for instance, and common experiences in this group of experiences of being in a bubble, or how you kind of more or less is able to go and back forth into that bubble. So there was more like that kind of commonality talks it was being practiced, and less about really talking about neurotypicals versus autistic. But in a political sense, it was good to use autistic versus neurotypical, or neurotypicals or parents versus us. So it's interesting with the labels, and what do you go to kind of, what label are you going to kind of try to argue for in Brazil?
Well, I'm not sure about what to say. I'm thinking on what you said. But if you ask what we think about it, I think we think from a pragmatic standpoint. See, so we think that the diagnosis and labels are pragmatic tools to reach certain achievements. This is what we tell our students, this is what we try to do in our work in institutions and so on. But if you look at the struggle between these groups, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, and so on, then this is very fuzzy. They don't have this, they don't even know really very much about this. For example, neurodiversity is not a very common word here in Brazil. As you said, as somebody said, Charlotte said, yeah. Neurodiversity is in the statistic because of Bach. Nobody talks about it. So there are certain concepts in this discussion that are unknown. So people are more closely linked to psychiatric diagnosis, and for example, I don't know, people here could say it better than me, but I think that even in the disability rights movements, the idea of a very strong identity is, they're still entrenched in this identity. They don't have this pragmatic view. See, this is an impression. I don't know what you think, Clarice and Barbara, about that. But I think this discussion about the pragmatic importance and the pragmatic role of words in general, and psychiatric diagnosis and labels is very feeble, very...
I think that not only the psychiatric diagnosis, but the psychoanalytical labels are still strong in Brazil. Neurosis, psychosis are still used by professionals, not by the lay, the lay people also. And so there are Brazilian, not Brazilian-made labels, but Brazilian pragmatically used labels to together with the psychiatric labels.
But it also has to do with the psychiatric reform, that the principle of the psychiatric reform is it was not to organize services, policies, etc. across diagnosis. So the idea of is like is the opposite of a normal psychiatric service or many services in the United States. You have a service for people with schizophrenia. For people here, it's like, you know, it's all people suffering from mental distress or emotional distress, and they thought that to label is depoliticize an issue. So that's why the other way around is that, as what Hannah is arguing, well, label can be politically significant. For the psychiatric reform, label was not politically significant, so the other way around. So maybe now that the autistic people, if they start to appear as a movement with self-advocates, advocating for special needs for them, special issues for them that appear, but till now there was to argue across diagnosis or labels was seen as depoliticizing an issue.
Talking about the identity thing, we start doing research in. I'm particularly doing research on a parents' association. So the activism, autism-related activism in Brazil is mostly led by parents. I've been conducting field work on a parents' association in a low-income area. I'm going to present on that tomorrow, but I'll say something about that today. So basically, because I'm an anthropologist, what that meant is that I hang out with these guys a lot for a long time, and when I mean hang out, I'm not just like watching them like do therapies, this and that. I'm just going there for their birthday parties. I'm hanging out at the kitchen where they're, you know, between one therapy intervention and another. And so I engage into a lot of casual conversations with them. And it's really fascinating how they play with this identity issue. They have this ongoing joke because one of the services they provide is screening to help neurologists or pediatricians come to a diagnosis. There's a speech therapist there who knows how to apply PEP, you know, some screening tools. She got really good at this, and that's actually a source of income for them. So they use this. It's American. It's a CERTS model. It's an education-related model, and that implies like doing a lot of scores. You know, like giving scores to this and that social communication performance. So they adopted this language of score. So they'll say, and it's sort of interesting how that sort of like breaks this whole autistic, non-autistic boundary. Because they'll say, well, this person, oh, you score, meaning you have autistic traits. So they'll say that to whoever, and they'll say that to me when I come there, like with my crazy stories. They're like, "Yeah, you definitely score." and it's really interesting how, because they live so involved with autism, it's so much a part of the world that at the same time that they distinguish, they know what's autistic, neurotypical. It's also something that they see all over the place, and the people that hang out with them really closely, like there's this woman who takes care of whatever there. She doesn't have any relatives. She's not a professional. She's somebody, and she has all these theories. They're absolutely fascinating. I was telling Benilton that she says she has this thing. She's like, nobody's pure. You know that nobody's purinho. Ninguém é purinho. So everybody has some autism. So. I mean, there's that, and there's also certain extreme situations when, for example, the son of the president of the association, he will go into a meltdown, and it's really hard. And so she came to me more than once. She's like, yeah, it's really nice, this whole talk of neurodiversity. She doesn't use this term. This term was brought by the speech therapists who read English, who reads internet and stuff, and she's like, yeah, we do neurodiversity, but she doesn't. And then she'll come to me and say, yeah, really nice to say autism is just difference, neurodiversity isn't that, but she doesn't know what it's like. She doesn't know what it's like to have a son who do something like this. It's not that easy. And she is somebody who I think lives really well with the autism person. The whole family, it's really, you know, together. They turned that experience into something positive. They founded the association like 15 years ago. They really empower themselves, like through having this really traumatic experience, or you know, having a son who you know, he's not like the worst kind of, but he's fairly autistic, and also adorable guy. I really like to hang out with him a lot, but it's hard to interact, and I think it's absolutely fascinating how like they engage the whole community into, you know, welcoming and accepting and dealing with that. But it's very clear. At some point it's very clear, but my point is like the whole identity, it sort of spills into whoever is around, the family or even like people that you come in touch with. And I myself, after having done field work for all this time, I started recognizing autism in a lot of people who are far from getting diagnosed, and it's okay. I think it can actually be very positive. It can be a very empowering thing for people who are on the spectrum. Like the fact that, you know, we neurotypicals find ourselves on the spectrum as well, like knowing that's a spectrum, that you know, that nobody's pure, that nobody's purely neurotypical or purely autistic. It can be really.
Can I just say one quick thing? Benilton said something about identity in disability rights movement. I'm going to answer something like, first, when we think about disability rights movement in Brazil, it's kind of an abstraction because it's a very complex movement. When you consider people with disability, there are groups that, you know, you can say that they go opposite ways in terms of identity politics, and certain groups are stronger attached to identities, such as deaf communities. Those users of sign languages are more, how do you say, they build themselves as a bold identity, disability identity. Blind people, they don't, but they are very politically organized around rights and, for example, access to health treatments and labor market laws. And they don't need that disabled identity. Autism, as Clarissa said, in Brazil is still something that has been pushed by parents' associations. And now you can say about self-advocacy is something that is quite new, and it's more like groups of sociality around this idea of autism, but not exactly as a political force. The political force in autism field comes from parents' associations. And I was going to say something else about field work, but now I got lost. So I think you have already enough.
Uma última pergunta, last question. I think that politics of score, it looks like evidence-based psychiatry. We act and we think as if you don't have a theory behind the score. Because to measure the score, we need to have an idea of what is intelligence, or what is affection, etc., etc. And the politics of evidence in psychiatry is a disaster. I don't know what that means in the field of autism. What do you think?
I just think it's also important to rethink about what is identity and what is social ability. Sometimes I know, I read my Goffman and so on, I know what social interaction is, but when I encounter people with autism, it's like, oh, it really doesn't work, but it is social ability, and it's sociality, but I have to use another kind of frame of thinking of what sociality is in order to understand it as sociality. And that's the same thing with identity. I think that the group I'm encountering is having or doing identity work, but they don't define it as identity work, because for them identity is something which they can't really, it's not really their term, and they feel yes, that's your term, that's your neurotypical terms, because identity for you, neurotypical, is very important. And you tell about your history, you tell about your now, and you tell about your future self. And that's part of your kind of narratives of yourself, but we don't do that. So you have to use other ways of thinking about what is identity. And
just to sort of build on Hannah's point, I think we have to be careful about what is wrong with identity. I think we start from the assumption that there's something wrong with identity politics. And for many groups, historically, not in the disability movement, identity has been a defining feature of figuring out who you are, and that serves citizenship purposes, it serves all kinds of political purposes that might not be obvious from the beginning. But we always frame it as a divisive politics, and I think we need to kind of correct the record on that. Second is the disability rights movement. I think the social model versus the medical model is not where people in disability studies are thinking. Folks are also recognizing that when we talk about a social model of disability, we forget that we lose impairment. Impairment is something that people want to talk about. It could connect with the idea of social suffering, but talking about disability only as something that has to be accommodated by society neglects the fact that people experience disability in very embodied kind of ways, and it's sometimes lost when we think about disability rights as being kind of the product of really embracing the social model.
Yes, that's an argument that psychoanalysts do use to criticize they wrongly criticize the idea of autism as a disability, because they take disability as something that has to do with what you were criticizing. So, but this is the argument. When psychoanalysts are suspicious of taking autism as a disability, it's because of that. Because that would make disability only a matter of social difference, or from one side. And from the other side, huh?
Social barriers.
Yeah, social barriers. And on the other side, if you take neurodiversity, the criticism would go on the other way around, because it would say, well, you take autism as something that is, at the beginning at least, non-subjective, non-relational, genetic, biological, and so on. So these are the ways people are.
Yeah, it's just like it's mischaracterizing what is actually happening, and people are thinking.
No, go on.
It mischaracterizes what people who think about disability are talking about. They're moving beyond the social model. They recognize that historically that was really important in kind of framing and advancing particular rights, but they understand that what got lost is impairment, what got lost is disability experience. And if that was, so it's not fair, I think, to say that the disability social model is this, because there's been more thinking, I guess.
Okay, but Michael, firstly, within the discussion of disability in autism, I don't think nobody defends the idea of social model and downplays impairment, because impairment is important in cognitive disabilities, which is not as important in physical disabilities, because even if you remove all barriers, those people will experience difficulties, etc. So that is the discussion between physical and emotional and cognitive and learning disability was always that the physical people who were advancing the very strong social model, like Mike Oliver and all of those, they were physically impaired, not cognitive. So but I think important is about identity politics. I do agree with you that you shouldn't say identity politics is not important, but I also say that identity politics is not only the only way to advance rights for different groups. I think identity politics is a form of organization that work very well in countries, or very relatively well in countries like the US, but not as well in other countries, because if you look, and we're not talking about Brazil, but to look about France, who was a whole different idea of organization based on universality and full inclusion and like Brazil, adaptation, miscegenation. So I don't think we should either say identity politics is good and all the groups should advance identity politics. For instance, blacks in Brazil, like when I remember once when Spike Lee was interviewed by a Brazilian journalist who was black, and he just said, "You blacks in Brazil, blah blah blah, you don't know what's that, you should advance a strong identity politics." He really misunderstood how Brazil works, and that maybe is not the best way to advance rights for Brazilian blacks or for Brazilian gays or so. So I don't think, because in the US and sometimes in Canada, it's taken for granted that identity politics is the best thing that you can do to get your rights, your claims, to advance your claims, and I think that is not in countries like Brazil or in countries like Spain or Italy or France, and that is a good discussion to put these two different styles of thinking, how social movements organize in discussion, just to undermine some basic assumptions, taking for granted that it's the best way to organize and to advance rights. So,
yeah, Michael himself, you yourself were saying at the lunch that in America, you and Jurandir were saying that in America, the identity politics movement, political identity movements in the South and in the North had completely different results. So perhaps this discussion, political identity politics or universality rights movement politics, which works best in which context? In Brazil, I think Paco is right. I think we will go further if we deepen our universality rights principle, because it's in the Constitution, it's in the SUS principles, and so on. And as you don't have here this ethnic conscience, it's kind of you have to enforce this idea. It's not natural, it's not consensual, the idea that you have to build up politics based on particular identities.
Because for a Brazilian, you can even say I'm an autistic, and in the second place I am Brazilian, but it is totally artificial for Brazil. In Brazil you can be that and that, but among that you're Brazilian. It's much more important what unites people, what they have in common, than they who have a difference. So, and that you see that even migrants who arrive in Brazil, second generation, totally integrate. In the second generation, we had that with the Japanese, we had that with Syrians, Lebanese, with Italian, they arrive here, second generation already married, with non-people from their own community. Jews, you don't have here very strong Jewish communities, have some, but really, really small. So it's a tendency in Brazilian culture to swallow difference, and I believe in many cases in a positive way. So it's like going against you're fighting against a current if you try to keep your difference, because it's a strong tendency to integrate you. So that's for good and for bad. Michael, for good and for bad, I am just describing. I'm not making a judgment of value of that. I'm just still.
I think Clarice's point about identity building within a particular space where she worked demonstrates the fact that counterposing one identity against another is not the way to think about identity politics within disability movement and within disability or autism. And I think what we're saying is you're Brazilian or you're autistic. It's not. I think we have multiple identities. We recognize that people sometimes perform identities in certain ways in certain contexts, and they don't need to be autistic in this environment. They don't need to be, but we're always talking about, that's the poverty of the discussion. We're talking about this as pitting one identity against another.
It's not identity politics. Identity politics is something that this identity just pervades you. You say that the LGBT is the best example, where you have this LGBT sociability, LGBT bookshops, LGBT travel agencies, LGBT. It's obviously that is they want to do not just an issue. So if I like a football team with another, and just when there is a match, that this identity is important or not, that is not in the identity politics, and that is not how the more vocal self-advocates argue. They argue that that is the most important, the defining feature of the identity. So it's pervasive identity, like Jim Sinclair or others speaking, you know, all the time you are just, of course, the way to think that, and I think my colleagues that are psychoanalysts, they would say, well, the normalcy or mental health means that you are able to switch from one identification to the other and not to fix in one and repeat that. That's the basis of psychoanalysis. So, but that is not what identity politics does. The other way around is to avoid that, because that is depoliticization. So when people ask for freedom, say, well, we should find an island called Aspergia where only Aspergers should live and just kick out all non-Aspergers. I mean, of course, that is rhetorics, but that doesn't mean that the thing, autism is just a small part of identity, you know.
This conversation.
I just think that the discussion is framed by the speaker, right? The location of the speaker and where we are. So to speak from that position of identity assumes a privilege, you know? I spent 6 months in the US as a white person in the south of the US as a Canadian, and my experience of that was colored by the fact that I'm a white privileged academic in that particular environment. So I think we have to just be careful when we talk about identities and sort of certain identities privileging other identities, that we're speaking from that position where we are able to kind of talk about the other, and I think it's problematic. I mean, I say that myself, I'm not just pointing it out, and that happens sometimes, I think, when we talk about expertise, and that when we sort of possess expertise, we can sort of allow other people to sort of intervene, but we are in control of that as well, and that privileged perspective. You know?
Just one more thing. I fully agree with you. I think you just misrepresented when you see people within identity politics switch identities. I think that is not the right depiction of the case. Not for the LGBT, not for the Black movement, not for the deaf movement. They don't switch identities. They stick to that identity, and I don't think that is bad. I think that is how it happens. You told me that the very vocal authors, the self-advocates, they just switch identities. Really, or at least it's not what I see. But I don't think that is bad. I think that is how it's happening.
I just think it's very interesting, this, because it's also what kind of meanings do we connect to identity politics. And in Sweden, identity politics might be something else than what you mean with identity politics, or what does it mean in a European or whatever context. And that makes me a bit confused, perhaps, because I'm not sure if we are making the same sense of identity politics.
What does it mean in Sweden?
I think it's more fluent, because we think we have been incorporating the idea from United States, but it's being colored by a Swedish context, so it becomes something else. So the identity politics, like the queer movement in Sweden, is not the same, as even though people talk about themselves in a kind of similar way, it's not the same, because it's so much colored by the idea of the Swedish welfare state, and the identity politics in the US scene is colored by a non-welfare state scene. So we do make communities, but it's another kind of community.
But I think we didn't answer Jurandir's questions about the theories behind the... Yeah, but I don't know if it's really a question. I agree with you that... No, I remember, but I don't think it's really a question. It's a comment about trying to review the theories behind these techniques.
No. I was asking you what you think about this politics of score. We neutralize the idea that we have a theory to measure the score. And I was saying that's very, 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 very near the evidence-based psychiatry. It's a kind of ideology. They say, we don't need theory to treat the other. We just need symptoms. We just need appearance, etc.
It's like the
Then to take pill, to take medicine.
it's
And you know, that's why
it's like the DSM, like the DSM,
like
the DSM bubble.
Like
Yeah.
exactly.
I just wanted to say for our colleagues the sample of race in Brazil, because for instance with Dilma and Lula government for the first time we have affirmative action in universities. So like 25% of the places should go to black people and Indians and etc. And all of us agree with us. I mean, probably there's nobody here who doesn't agree. But many people on the left, no, I'm not talking people on the right who disagree because they don't like blacks and they don't want to see blacks at university. But even many people on the left disagree because that is going to racialize our society. That's going to become Brazil like United States with the hate among the races. They had several people arguing like that. So you see how race organized different in Brazil.
I disagree. They are in the right-wing of society, not the left.
Brazil is racialized. It's not. What else do you have to say? No.
What did you say?
And then he leaves.
No, Peter Fry, era izquierda.
Yes,
y Mona
Yeah, I would say that the identity politics discussion has been really focused on national identity actually. So you have, I mean, you have the Brazilian identity and the US identity and the Swedish identity, so I think we're all susceptible to that. No, my question is just about it includes much of the black affirmative action, what you just talked about. You think the Brazilian identity is something that's inclusive? Is that going to last forever? Is that like so fixed? Because I see it kind of changing in Black rights movement in Brazil definitely has acquired a US-like rhetoric. I think the LGBT movement as well. So do you think, don't you think that could change in like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years and maybe we'll become slowly more US-like? Or do you think it's just a cultural thing that's not, that's strong enough that it's always going to be the current for inclusion or universality or whatever you want to call it?
Well, as one politician, well-known politician, Brazilian politician said, future belongs to God. We don't know what's going to happen in next week. Well, nowadays next week, tomorrow. But I think that this black movement in Brazil is not as strong as it is in other countries, but it exists for now, what, 20, 30 years? And up to the present, up to now, we don't have this. We don't have nothing that is similar to what happens in the States. We even the word, the term Afro-Brasileiro, African Brazilian, it isn't really very much used, even by black people. We don't have, for example, Afro-descendants. Yeah, perhaps a little bit more.
Afro-descendant.
So a bit more used.
Not as much, but Denise, it is used, but not as much as it could be used in the United States. Not all, because probably almost, I don't know, 95% of blacks in America would define themselves as Afro-Americans or Afro-descendants. No? Here, people who wouldn't use that. Some people use that. With his question is good because you say, okay, with the influence of America, influence of social movements and identity politics, wouldn't be that the case in 20 years? It might be the case, or 30 years. But I think that I mean, for the countries that I know Brazilian, I live here 20 years now, and for the countries that I know, Brazil is the country that best assimilates and incorporates differences in its own identity. So the differences are not negated; they're just incorporated. So to be Brazilian is also to be a bit Italian. It's also to be a bit. No, I mean it's how I feel. And for instance, we have. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but I have here at the institute several colleagues that are Jews. But you don't know that. Sometimes you know because of the name or the surname, family name. But it's not something that is obvious, that it would be obvious in the United States of Canada. I know because sometimes some colleagues say, no, because I'm Jew and I went to the Jewish school when I was a child. Because it would be so obvious in other countries that person is Jew, the way he speaks. I mean,
It's not relevant in day-to-day life.
and that is seen as positive. It's not seen as some sort of ideological backwardness. It's seen as something positive of Brazilian identity, as social capital.
Well, at least that's the way some of us think about it. You don't have, for example, Martin Scorsese in Italian American. We don't have nothing like that in Brazil. There's no Nipo-American, Italian American, Japanese, Brazilian, Japanese, Brazilian, Nipo-Brazilian. There is no. Yeah, but everybody is
Brazilian. None of them will say I am
Japanese.
Chinese is more separate.
But then you have to explore why people do not express that identity. It's partly because it's not.
No, they express, Michael, they express tradition. If you go to São Paulo, there are lots of people who come from Japan. So you have Japanese restaurant, Japanese food, and you have lots of things. But it's not an ethical issue if you mean by that a political statement. It's not. It doesn't. I think the best example are the Jews. There are lots of Jews that are friends of us, but if somebody asks, who are the Jews you know? I have to think a lot about and go name by name. This is Jew, because it doesn't matter in day-to-day life. There's this movie about the Boston Catholic scandal that was Spotlight. Have you seen Spotlight?
That's very good.
Yeah, there's a scene in which two people, they're talking, two men are talking, and they have immigrant names, and then one asks the other, what are you? One says, I'm Portuguese, and the other says, well, I'm Italian, I don't know. But they were Armenian, yes. I'm Armenian, you're Portuguese, well, so but they were born in the States. They're Portuguese and Armenian in a way that would not be really possible in Brazil. Nobody who is the son of a Portuguese who was born here would say, I'm Portuguese. He would only say, well, my father is a Portuguese. You see? So this is the tale, but I think it says much about even the problems we have. For example, we're talking here about Brazilian identity, but Brazilian identity isn't really that existing. What is it like to be a Brazilian? If you ask that, I think nobody will have a straight answer, because nobody thinks about it. You don't see Brazilian flags all over the cities like you see in the States, like you see in Argentina. You don't see that.
Only when it's football match or something like that, but otherwise you never see it. So, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Amanhã 9:30 começa.